listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio. Mysteries of the Bible present Queen Esther. Enjoy and have a glorious day.
On a cold March day in Germany, in the ashes of World War II, recently liberated Jewish survivors of Nazi death camps celebrated a joyful affirmation of life. The ancient festival of Purim, the biblical story said to have happened in Persia over 2,000 years ago, of one woman's fight to save her people from the first threat of genocide in recorded history.
Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to slay, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children. Esther 3:13.
Strangely, the name of God does not appear in the book of Esther, not even once. The ancient text fascinates and mystifies scholars to this day.
Certainly the major mystery of the book of Esther is whether it actually happened, whether it's a real story, or whether it's an invented tale.
Did Queen Esther actually live? Why was the book of Esther so feared by Adolf Hitler that he banned it and forbade the celebration of Purim? And why have the oppressed clung to the biblical Esther story for thousands of years? These are but a few of the mysteries of the Bible.
And the Lord shall scatter you among the peoples, and ye shall be left few in number among the nations. Deuteronomy 4:27.
It is approximately 587 years before the birth of Christ. To the Jewish people, the horrifying sight of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem set ablaze by the Babylonians must have seemed like the end of the world. Then, the Jews are to endure an even more profound tragedy, as King Nebuchadnezzar takes them with him into captivity in his kingdom of Babylonia. Most will never see their beloved homeland again. In 539 before the Common Era, however, the Babylonians are themselves conquered by Cyrus the Great of Persia. And so it is that the Jews are scattered to the winds. Some are transported 1,000 miles east to the cities of Susa and Persepolis, located in the Empire of Persia, one of the greatest civilizations the world had yet known. Here in modern-day Iran, the ancient ruins of these cities are whispering still of glorious days and nights long gone by. The Bible indicates that in the Persian winter capital of Susa, there lived a Jewish exile named Mordecai, who was the guardian of a young woman who would play a decisive role in the history of her people.
He had brought up Esther, the daughter of his uncle. The maiden was beautiful and lovely, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. Esther 2:7.
Whether Esther emigrated to Persia with Mordecai or was born there remains an enigma. But as a Jew living in exile, Esther must have felt like an outsider in the majestic foreign culture of the Persian capital at the apex of its power. It is not known how many Jews lived in Persia in Esther's time, but though they would have resembled the Persians in appearance, scholars believe the Jews differed from them in their culture, their dietary laws, and their belief in one God. Did the Persians oppress the Jews, or live up to their benign propaganda of tolerance?
We do have evidence from outside the book of Esther of persecution against the Jews. There can be, at times, even under the tolerant Persian Empire, instances of ethnic hatred.
Living as part of a vulnerable minority, Esther could never have suspected that she would soon become queen to the powerful king of Persia. Nor could she have dreamed that her story would become one of the most controversial books in the Bible.
The events here related happened in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces, in those days when the king sat on his royal throne in Susa, the capital. Esther 1:1.
Who was the mighty king Ahasuerus described in the Bible? When translated into Greek, Ahasuerus becomes Xerxes, the name of a king who reigned over Persia between 486 and 465 before the Common Era.
The character of Ahasuerus, who's depicted in the biblical book of Esther, fits well with what we know about Xerxes, who was hot-tempered and could be mean-spirited and capricious.
Archaeologists have excavated Xerxes' winter palace at Susa in modern-day Iran. They have found intriguing clues linking archaeological evidence to the biblical Esther story.
The excavations provide details which help to confirm the accuracy of the story. In other words, somebody would have had to gone to the city or had a good knowledge of it in order to be able to write up the story in that way, to present those details of architecture and layout of the city.
The courtyard was decorated with white and violet cotton curtains. Couches of gold and silver were on a mosaic pavement of green, white, shell, and marble. Esther 1:6.
In a strange twist of fate, Esther would soon find herself swept into this world of breathtaking Persian splendor because of the whim of a drunken king during a feast that lasted for days.
On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command. At this, the king was enraged, and his anger burned within him. Esther 1:12.
A number of the ancient Jewish writers maintained that she refused to come before the drunken group, not because they were drunk, but she understood them, the king, to be saying, "Come to me with your crown," but nothing else. That is to say that the king was asking her to appear stark naked before this group.
Whatever the reason for Vashti's refusal, some scholars see her as the forgotten heroine of the Esther story.
The character of Vashti is very interesting because she does have this very obvious spirit of rebellion. For the last 100 years, there have been scholars who have suggested that Vashti is the first feminist and is punished for it in the story by the author.
Modern interpreters sometimes tend to exalt Vashti over Esther, but the early rabbinical interpreters were by no means inclined to interpret Vashti's actions in that way. To the contrary, they seem disturbed at the prospect that this woman, or any woman, would act in violation of her husband's orders.
For refusing his request to appear, the enraged king Ahasuerus has Vashti deposed immediately. The biblical king's impulsive behavior is consistent with what historians know of the Persian king Xerxes.
Xerxes could shift from hot to cold very rapidly. In one moment, he'd be very magnanimous and kind. On another occasion, he'd have somebody executed right before his eyes.
Ahasuerus then sends out emissaries in search of a new queen.
Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the maiden who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. Esther 2:4.
Scholars agree that this was no mere beauty contest. In fact, some even believe the young women may have been forcibly taken from their families without their consent.
When many maidens were gathered in Susa, the capital, Esther also was taken into the king's palace. Esther 2:8.
The king orders that all of these beautiful young women be brought in, and they go through 12 months of beautifying treatments. And at the end of 12 months, each woman has one night with the king. And depending upon how the king feels about her, she may or may not become the next queen of Persia.
The Bible makes no mention of the crucial moment when the king and Esther meet. The text merely announces the royal verdict.
The king loved Esther more than all the women, so he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Esther 2:17.
Though she is crowned queen, Esther harbors a secret, that she is a Jew. But would Esther have been able to conceal her Jewish identity in the Persian court?
Considering the fact that all these people lived in an ancient Semitic environment, it would not have been difficult for Esther to have concealed her identity.
An unexpected and deadly turn of events is about to overtake the new queen of the most powerful empire on earth. Esther, who has not revealed to the king that she is a Jew, has been crowned Queen of Persia. But before she will be called upon to save her people, Mordecai is plunged into another palace intrigue, a plot which he discovers because he has stationed himself at the city gate.
As Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Esther 2:21.
Archaeologists have been fascinated by the frequent references to the city gate as a focal point of intrigue.
That gate, the main gate of the business part of the palace area, has been excavated. It's a very large gate. It's about 20 by 30 yards in size. And that's where the regular, everyday business of the kingdom was carried on.
Because Mordecai overhears the guards plot against the king at the palace gate, the king's would-be assassins are hanged. Ironically, this biblical story of a threat on Ahasuerus' life would echo the actual fate of Persian King Xerxes, for he would himself be assassinated. During the reign of Xerxes, when Esther would have been queen, across the Atlantic Ocean, smoking pipes were used in North America in rituals and by shamans for healing. In the Far East, Confucius, the famous Chinese philosopher, developed his system of ethics, placing a high value on learning. And in Greece, the consumption of wine became a new form of social entertainment for the wealthy class. In Persia, no sooner have the would-be assassins of Ahasuerus been hanged than Mordecai confronts Haman, one of the arch-villains of the entire Bible.
And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down to Haman. But Mordecai did not bow down. Esther 3:2.
Mordecai's refusal to bow down will spark bloody events to come. Scholars have long debated the enigmatic reason for Mordecai's decision. Some believe that Haman was hostile to Mordecai because they came from enemy tribes.
We may deduce that Mordecai's reaction to Haman goes back to an ancient feud between Mordecai's ancestor Saul, the first king of Israel, and Agag, who was one of Haman's early ancestors.
And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down to him, Haman was filled with fury. Esther 3:6.
So enraged is Haman that he decides to kill not only Mordecai, but all the Jews. To determine what the best day will be to put his sinister plan into action, Haman consults someone skilled in casting lots, a kind of dice used to decide a course of action.
They cast Pur, that is the lot, before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month, till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Esther 3:7.
Haman convinces the king to issue a terrible proclamation.
Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to slay, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, and to plunder their goods. Esther 3:13.
In Esther, there's a motif that is really quite unusual. The motif of a religious persecution. And religious persecution is actually very rare, almost non-existent in the ancient world. Peoples might be conquered, but their religions were never outlawed.
When Mordecai learns of Haman's plot to destroy the Jews, he contacts Esther. Mordecai begs her to go to the king to plead for her people, but Esther fears it would be too dangerous.
If any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter that he may live. And I have not been called to the king these 30 days. Esther 4:11.
Some experts criticize Esther for her hesitation.
Doesn't do much credit to Esther. She doesn't stand out in the way that a half a dozen other great women in the Hebrew Bible stand out as real characters because of courage, brains, faith, something. Esther seems to me always just a pretty cardboard lady.
Despite Esther's fears, Mordecai is insistent.
For if you keep silence at such a time as this, you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to this kingdom for such a time as this? Esther 4:14.
Will Esther risk her life and reveal her Jewish identity to help her people? Some scholars see this turning point as central to the meaning of the Esther story.
Esther's Jewish identity is appealed to, and she responds. So she changes from passive to active.
Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther 4:16.
As the fate of her people hangs precariously in the balance, Esther prepares to confront the king in the most dangerous gamble of her life. Mindful that she is placing herself in mortal danger to approach the king unsummoned, Esther at last ventures into the royal presence.
And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she found favor in his sight. And the king said to her, "What is your request? It shall be given you even to the half of my kingdom." Esther 5:3.
In a story rich in mysteries, no character is more puzzling than Esther herself. But when she finally has her audience with the king, she makes no mention of Haman's plot. Instead, Esther has a seemingly innocent request.
And Esther said, "Let the king and Haman come to this day to a dinner that I have prepared for the king." Esther 5:4.
She gives instructions to Mordecai. She does take the role, the dangerous role, of going into the king to start the process in motion, to undo this very dangerous edict.
She could right there have said, Haman is planning to kill the Jews and I want it stopped. But she doesn't. She says, come to a party. Now this is playing court games. It's a good literary device for the writer because it allows the story to build up with suspense and all kinds of things. But it doesn't do much credit to Esther.
Glowing from his royal feast, Haman leaves the palace. But at the city gate, he sees something that enrages him.
When Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Esther 5:9.
A furious Haman orders the construction of a gallows 50 cubits high to hang Mordecai. If it was actually built, such a gallows would have towered an astonishing 75 feet into the air. With Mordecai and the Jewish people now falling under the shadow of the gallows, events take a surprising turn. A case of royal insomnia inspired by fate or divine providence.
On that night the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Esther 6:1.
The one person you can identify with real motives and real goodnesses and vices, is the king Ahasuerus. He's intelligent and takes his job seriously. I mean, he reads the royal archives at night when he can't sleep.
The Chronicles remind the king that Mordecai saved his life from attempted assassination, and he learns that, inexplicably, no royal reward was given him. So the king asks Haman for advice.
The king said to him, "What shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" Esther 6:6.
Thinking the king intends to honor him, Haman tells the king that the one to be honored should ride on horseback in a royal robe, led through the streets by one of the king's princes. To Haman's astonishment, the king then orders Haman to lead Mordecai on horseback through the streets. Haman must reward the very man he hates most. Scholars believe this startling turn of events reveals a surprising dimension to the Esther story.
Interestingly enough, in spite of the fact that there is all this vengeance and murder and intrigue, there are many scholars who would say that Esther has a comedic or humorous dimension to it. And I agree with that.
After Haman's humiliation, the stage is set for the climax, as Esther invites an unsuspecting Haman and the king to another feast. At last, Esther reveals that she is a Jew, and she speaks for herself and her people.
Let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to be annihilated. Esther 7:4.
While she may start off as a meek and mild ward of Mordecai, by the end she's a very self-contained, imperial, confident woman.
The fact that at the time when her people were in danger, she made the decision to reveal her identity and to stand with her people who were threatened with genocide, the first case of genocide, is an inspiring story for Jews and all people of faith.
Then King Ahasuerus said to Esther, "Who is he, and where is he that would presume to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Esther 7:7.
Stunned, the king storms out. For a ruler with the power to command death at his whim, Ahasuerus shows remarkable restraint by taking his time to collect his thoughts. Not so with the panicked Haman, who throws himself on Esther and begs for his life.
And the king returned as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" Esther 7, 8.
The enraged king commands that Haman be hanged on the very gallows Haman had prepared for Mordecai. And the king permits Mordecai to issue another edict, permitting the Jews to defend themselves.
So the Jews smote all their enemies with the sword, slaughtering and destroying them. Now the other Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives, and slew 75,000 of those who hated them. Esther 9:16.
Scholars have been mystified by the meaning of these seemingly exaggerated numbers.
There is a high-spirited reading in which the triumph is at a ridiculous level. It's not just exaggerated, it's a satire at a ridiculous level.
The acts of the Jews in killing Persians are not motivated by rage or resentment. Rather, the text makes clear that the Jews are acting in self-defense, and that what they do to their enemies is precisely what their enemies intended to do for them.
In honor of their salvation, Mordecai sends out an edict that they will celebrate a holiday to commemorate their deliverance. It will be named Purim, after the lots Haman threw to decide which day to kill the Jews. A holiday of joyful thanksgiving.
That they should make these days of feasting and gladness, days for sending choice portions to one another and gifts to the poor. Esther 9:22.
The story of Esther and Mordecai was preserved by the Jews through the centuries in their annual celebration of Purim. And yet, how much of the Esther story is true? How much merely a legend? The quest to discover whether Esther and Mordecai actually lived has led archaeologists here to Bar-Am in northern Israel to investigate a site where, according to tradition, Queen Esther was buried. Scholars have concluded such legends have no basis in fact, for Bar-Am is too remote from the ancient Persian capital for Esther to have possibly been buried here. And yet, the controversy over whether Esther and Mordecai ever lived persists.
Archaeology has not been able, in my judgment, and I think in the minds of many others, to prove the essential historicity of the Esther narrative.
Other experts examining the same evidence have reached drastically different conclusions.
I think Mordecai had a real historical existence, and I think Esther was a real historical personality. Her name fits well with the time. It's a known name of the time.
I believe that the story of Esther can certainly be considered to be historical. The many details of the Persian names, Persian customs, Persian languages are certainly quite convincing.
One of the most intriguing clues to the riddle of whether or not Esther and Mordecai actually existed lies in the name of Mordecai himself.
We know the name was in common use. We have tablets from the Persian city of Persepolis, about 12 of them that mention in cuneiform writing a man named Mardukah. The question that goes beyond that is it the same individual in the tablets that we know from the biblical book of Esther? And that's an open question. It may be him, it may not be him. We're not sure. There isn't a good way to absolutely prove it.
As puzzling as the question of whether Mordecai and Esther ever lived is the controversy surrounding the book of Esther itself. A controversy which was only heightened by a startling discovery made in the late 1940s in the caves of Qumran on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. Here, in an astonishing state of preservation, scrolls were discovered, which scholars believe belonged to a zealous sect of religious Jews approximately 2,000 years ago. Examining these Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars discovered something remarkable because of its absence.
There's not a single copy of any fragment or text of Esther found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the only book of the Hebrew Bible that's not found in some form.
Was the book of Esther destroyed by the ravages of time? Or is it perhaps a treasure waiting to be discovered somewhere in the cliffs and caves of Qumran?
The absence of the book of Esther in the Dead Sea Scrolls poses a very serious problem for scholars. Now, my judgment on this issue is that it's accidental. It's not there because it's not there. The argument from silence gets you nowhere.
Many scholars, however, disagree. They believe ancient rabbis deliberately excluded the book of Esther from the Dead Sea Scrolls. As evidence, they point to an intriguing clue.
We have a manuscript from the Dead Sea Scrolls which tells us of the festivals that were celebrated by these people, and Purim is not included.
Why did the ancient rabbis so strongly disapprove of the book of Esther and the holiday of Purim associated with it?
It's probably the theology of Esther. That is to say that there is very little theology. And it's a very wild narrative, really. It's a narrative of a Jewish triumph in the court of the king of Persia that really isn't that religious on the surface.
Centuries after the period of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the bitter debate over the book of Esther continued to flare.
We know for a fact that there were rabbis in the 2nd and 3rd, perhaps even the 4th century of the Christian era or the Common Era, who did not accept Esther as inspired scripture.
As late as the 16th century, Protestant theologian Martin Luther would admit that, in his words, he was hostile to the book of Esther because, among other faults, it had much pagan impropriety. Today, however, many scholars see the long-maligned book of Esther in a very different light.
I personally think that the book of Esther is a religious book, not cast in religious language. God is not on the stage acting as he is in some books. Rather, I envision God as sort of inspiring and guiding the speakers.
In the 4th century BCE, the powerful Persian Empire, the mighty domain of King Ahasuerus in the book of Esther, would itself fall to the sword of another conqueror, Alexander the Great of Macedonia. But somehow the book of Esther endured, flourishing with a vibrant life of its own. Whenever a Jewish community was saved from plague, persecution, or natural disaster, the people would joyfully celebrate their deliverance each year with a local Purim festival. The story of Esther held special significance in the Middle Ages, when the Jews were persecuted in much of Europe. Through these years of oppression, the brightly colored scrolls of the book of Esther kindled the fires of hope.
apart from the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses. We have more medieval scrolls of Esther than of any other book of the Hebrew Bible. I think that's not accidental. I think that in the tortured history of Jews in the medieval period, that this was a book that offered hope.
In contrast to Martin Luther, Maimonides, the great Jewish scholar of 12th century Spain, ranked the book of Esther as the most important book in the Bible after the 5 books of Moses. Perhaps it was because he believed the Esther story would instruct the Jews in how to survive in exile from the Holy Land. In 1492, during the Inquisition, the Jews were expelled from Spain. Through much of Europe, they secretly celebrated Purim in basements and attics, clinging to its message of survival. Why has the book of Esther endured?
A book that offered hope, that in the most hopeless and dangerous of situations, in some mysterious and inexplicable way, there would come along deliverers.
In 1924, Adolf Hitler foretold his malignant vision in his anti-Semitic book, Mein Kampf. When he came to power in Germany in 1933, the Jews faced a threat greater than any they had known in their entire 4,000-year history. Hitler harbored a venomous hatred for the Book of Esther and the holiday of Purim. Unless Germany is victorious, he proclaimed, Jewry could then celebrate the destruction of Europe by a second triumphant Purim festival. When Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, he banned the reading of the Book of Esther and ordered that all synagogues be closed and barred on the holiday of Purim. And yet, even as night descended over Europe, the Jews clung to the story of Esther as a light in the darkness.
How do we survive? How do we maintain our identity as a people? How can we escape oppression? How can we negotiate kings? Those sorts of questions are answered in the book of Esther.
On Purim 1942, in one town in Nazi-occupied Poland, 10 Jews were hanged by Hitler's SS in a sadistic parody of events in the Book of Esther. But, as a testament to the power of their faith in Esther's message of hope, it was reported that as the Jewish martyrs went to their death on Purim, they were singing. In one of the profound ironies surrounding the Book of Esther, the story which ancient rabbis had sought to exclude from the Bible as unworthy provided spiritual inspiration for the Jewish people when they needed it most. The lessons of the Book of Esther transcend the struggle of any one people to make a statement with universal meaning about the nature of good and evil.
There are still Mordecais and still Esthers in life, and that's good, but the really unfortunate thing is that the world still has a lot of Hamans.
Though it tells of the survival of the Jews, Esther's story holds a message for all peoples, a message of moral responsibility, a statement against hatred and bigotry, whoever its victims may be, whether in Queen Esther's time or our own.
That these days should be remembered and celebrated by every single generation, family, province, and city, and that the memory of them should never die among their descendants. Esther 9:28.
I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for listening on Second Chance Ministry.